Kansas City is often described as the heartbeat of the American Midwest, a city that spent the better part of the 20th century trying to outrun its own cowtown reputation. By 1981, it seemed to have finally crossed the finish line. If architecture is the dictionary definition of a city's ambition, then the Hyatt Regency was a shout of pure, unadulterated hubris. It was a 40-story monument of glass and silver, a sprawling edifice that didn't just house guests, it hosted the very idea of a modern, sophisticated future. Inside the hotel's atrium, a term that feels too small for a 40-story canyon of light, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the optimistic hum of a Friday night. Nearly 1,600 people had flocked to the urban center for the weekly tea dance, a lively social ritual where the city's well-to-do gathered to sway to the notes of the Steve Miller Orchestra. But the real magic, the detail that everyone agreed made the Hyatt an icon, wasn't on the ground. It was suspended in the air. 3 elegant skywalks, ribbons of concrete and steel, spanned the vast lobby. They were architectural trophies, designed to offer a pioneer's view of the festivities below. To stand on the 4th-floor walkway was to experience a specific kind of American flamboyance. You felt elite, detached from the mundane laws of the earth, as if you were walking on a cloud of high society promise. People leaned against the railings, champagne glasses in hand, watching the sea of dancers below. From this height, the city felt invincible. The engineering felt like a conquest over gravity itself. Then, at exactly 7:05 p.m., the music was punctuated by a sound that would silence Kansas City for decades. It wasn't a roar, and it wasn't an explosion. It was a sharp, dry, metallic snap, the sound of a single steel nut stripping through a box beam like a bullet through wet cardboard. It was the sound of a material reaching its limit and finally surrendering. In less than 5 seconds, the future pancaked. The 4th-floor walkway groaned and tilted, its connection points failing in a catastrophic rhythmic sequence. It plummeted onto the 2nd-floor walkway directly beneath it, and together, 60 tons of glass, steel, and humanity crashed into the crowded dance floor. The jazz was replaced by a cloud of white plaster dust, and a silence so sudden it felt like the building itself had stopped breathing. When the dust settled, the greatest landmark of Kansas City had become the dictionary definition of a disaster. 114 lives were pulverized in a lobby that was supposed to be a sanctuary of luxury. But as the sirens began to wail and the city began to dig through the wreckage of its own pride, a chilling truth began to emerge. This wasn't an act of God, and it wasn't a failure of the steel's soul. The killer was a single, unchecked line on a drafting table, a convenient modification that no one bothered to verify, a tiny error that carried the absolute weight of a death sentence. Welcome to the Death Drawing, the story of the Hyatt Regency collapse. To understand the tragedy of the Hyatt, we must first look at the empire that built it. Kansas City in the 1970s was a city in the midst of a radical identity crisis. For decades, it had been comfortably defined by its stockyards and its jazz, a cowtown with a big heart, but a modest skyline. But the 1970s brought a different kind of hunger. The city was blossoming, rapidly on an ascension to becoming a key American center of commerce. And at the heart of this transformation was the Hall family, the patriarchs of the Hallmark cards empire. This wasn't just a greeting card company, it was the dictionary definition of a corporate dynasty. The Halls envisioned more than just paper and ink. They envisioned a city within a city, a $500 million conquest called Crown Center. It was intended to be Detroit's Washington Boulevard on steroids, a sprawling, 85-acre redevelopment that would turn a rundown patch of urban neglect into a fashionable destination that could compete with the likes of New York or Chicago. Inside this faded urban canvas, the Hyatt Regency was to be the centerpiece, the most special achievement in the Hall's ambitious portfolio. The stage was set with an almost silver spoon arrogance. The project was fueled by an indisputable wealth that demanded flamboyance in design. The architects, the legendary firm of Jack D. Gillum and Associates, were commissioned to create an edifice unlike anything standing. They wanted a lobby that felt like a cathedral of light, a place where the social elite could be seen from every angle. This was corporate America taking hold in its most majestic form, and the pressure to deliver a monument of the future was mammoth in size. But even a $500 million dream has a budget, and more importantly, a deadline. The progression of the design said it all. To achieve the floating aesthetic the halls desired, the engineering had to be surgical. The skywalks were the industry's stepping stone toward a new preference for lightness and transparency. However, the industry that this design represented would be the making and breaking of the project. Logistics back then were far from next-day delivery. The complexity of the skywalk's support system, 45-foot continuous steel rods, was already causing a stir in the steel yards. According to reports from the time, the project was plagued by a type of cost and pressure that often leads to cake-decorator decisions, where aesthetics are prioritized over the gritty, boring limitations of structural physics. A pretext for the abandonment of safety occurred as early as 1979. During the final stages of construction, a massive section of the atrium's glass skylight collapsed. It was a miracle that no one was hurt. The incident loosened the city's confidence, calling for expensive restoration and a re-evaluation of the building's integrity. But instead of a full-stop investigation, the project pushed forward. The dream was too expensive to fail. The owners had already invested millions to upgrade and repair the dying image of the project before it even opened. In short, the Hyatt was a mess before the first guest even checked in. The arrogance of the Silver Spoon developers, mixed with the lack of experience in such radical designs, was a dangerous combination. They wanted the grandeur of Fifth Avenue, but they were building on a foundation of compromise. To understand how a masterpiece becomes a massacre, one must look at the secret life of blueprints. In the sterile, air-conditioned drafting rooms of Jack D. Gillum and Associates, the skywalks were a stroke of theoretical genius. The original design called for 45-foot continuous steel rods, long, elegant needles of threaded metal that would pierce through the fourth-floor walkway and continue down to the second, anchoring the weight of both directly into the massive ceiling trusses. It was a singular, clean exercise in physics. One rod, one load, one path to the sky. But in the world of heavy industry, theory often meets the jagged edge of logistics. Shift the scene to the Haven Steel Company yard. Here, the air doesn't smell of ink and ambition. It smells of ozone, hot grease, and the frantic pressure of a construction deadline. When the fabricators looked at those 45-foot rods, they didn't see a monument of the future. They saw a clumsy and impractical nightmare. To install a rod that long, workers would have to thread a nut halfway up its length without damaging the delicate grooves. A process that was tedious, expensive, and, in the eyes of the boots-on-the-ground builders, hopelessly out of date. What happened next was a cake decorator's heist of structural integrity. Haven Steel proposed a modification, a minor tweak for the sake of convenience. Instead of one continuous rod, they suggested using two shorter ones. The first rod would hang from the ceiling to hold the fourth floor. The second rod would then be hooked into the fourth-floor beam to hang the second floor. On a flat piece of paper, the change looked nearly unrecognizable. It was a trinket of efficiency, a way to speed up the assembly line and save a few dollars in labor. But as the red pen flicked across the shop drawings, the laws of gravity were being rewritten in the dark. Think of it like a human chain. In the original design, two men were hanging onto a single rope. The rope felt the weight of both, but each man only had to hold his own weight. By splitting the rod, the engineers had created a dead man's anchor. Now, the first man was hanging onto the rope, and the second man was hanging onto the first man's ankles. The rope was fine, but the first man's grip was now forced to carry a doubled load. This wasn't an engineering conquest. It was a preloaded trap. The fourth-floor box beam's thin pieces of steel, never intended for such a burden, were now the sole connection point for 60 tons of concrete and humanity. The most special achievement of this heist, however, was the silence of the professionals. When these modified shop drawings arrived back at the engineering firm, they weren't met with a calculator or a skeptical eye. In a moment of catastrophic silver spoon confidence, the drawings were stamped and signed. No one performed the math. No one checked the compounded stress. The dictionary definition of a professional engineer is someone who guards the public safety. But in the rush to meet the Crown Center deadline, that guard had left his post. The building was now a ticking clock made of iron and box beams. As the Hyatt prepared for its grand opening, the steel was already groaning in a language humans rarely hear. The heist was complete. They had traded the integrity of the design for the convenience of the contractor, and the bill was about to come due. In the world of high-stakes architecture, a building often tries to tell you it's dying long before the first crack appears. For the Hyatt Regency, that warning came in 1979, during the final stages of its construction. A massive section of the atrium's glass roof, a $500 million skylight intended to let in the Kansas City sun, simply gave up and crashed to the floor. It was a miracle that the sand was empty at the time, a close call that should have necessitated a total, brutal reevaluation of every weld and every bolt. But the architectural elitists and the silver spoon developers didn't have time for humility. They dismissed it as an isolated incident, a clumsy error in the skylight's own support. The industry that this design represented was moving too fast to look back. They polished the marble, cleaned the glass, and opened the doors, inviting the city to walk into a masterpiece that was already on hospice. Fast forward to the 17th of July, 1981. It was a Friday night, and the Hyatt's heart was beating at a fever pitch. Nearly 1,600 people had filled the atrium for the tea dance, an event that felt like a postcard from a more dignified era. As the Steve Miller Orchestra played the lively notes of a jazz standard, the skywalks were mammoth in size and popularity. On the second and fourth floor walkways, hundreds of people gathered to watch the dancers below. They were swaying to the music, their collective weight creating a subtle, rhythmic vibration. To the common people on those platforms, it felt like the give of a modern skyscraper. But deep within the drywall and the Italian Renaissance ornamentation, the steel was screaming. At exactly 7:05 p.m., the engineering heist of 1,978 finally demanded its payment. It wasn't a roar. It was a sharp, dry snap, the sound of the fourth-floor box beams literally unfolding like a piece of origami. The steel nuts, which were forced to carry a load twice as mammoth as they were designed for, stripped through the metal. The fourth-floor walkway groaned, tilted, and then pancaked directly onto the second-floor walkway below. In less than 5 seconds, 60 tons of concrete, glass, and humanity surrendered to gravity. The future crashed onto the crowded dance floor in a cloud of white plaster dust, and a silence so sudden it felt like the building had lost its soul. The scene that followed was the dictionary definition of a nightmare. The Than Dung Kin, Cathedral of Glass, was now a brutalist tomb. Water from the broken sprinkler system began to flood the marble floors, mixing with the debris of a party that had turned into a slaughterhouse. As the first responders arrived, they found a landscape of urban decay created in an instant. They had to use kuamai, chainsaws, to cut through the rubble, while the cake-decorated grandeur of the hotel mocked the rescue efforts from above. 114 lives were lost that night, not because of a bomb, and not because of an act of God. They were lost because a firm was too cake-decorator to check their math, and a city was too silver spoon to listen to the groans of the steel. The sky had fallen, and the price of that convenient red pen modification was finally etched in blood. The morning after the skywalks fell, Kansas City woke up to a different dictionary definition of its own skyline. The Than Dung Kin, Cathedral of Glass, was no longer a symbol of modern flamboyant grandeur. It was a hollowed-out crime scene. As the cranes began the mammoth task of lifting 60 tons of mangled concrete and steel from the atrium floor, the city's heart remained under the rubble. This wasn't just a structural failure. It was a professional execution of the American dream. The investigation that followed was a brutal post-mortem of corporate arrogance. Experts from the National Bureau of Standards descended upon the ruins, looking for the murder weapon. They didn't find it in a faulty batch of steel or a sudden seismic shift. They found it in the laboratory, where they recreated the fourth-floor box beams. Under the unforgiving gaze of high-speed cameras, they watched as the steel designed by cake decorators and approved by silver spoon elites simply unfolded. The $2 times dollar load wasn't a theory anymore. It was a death sentence written in the language of physics. The legal fallout was just as mammoth in size. Over $140 million in damages were awarded to the victims and their families, a trivial sum when compared to the 114 lives extinguished for the sake of a contractor's convenient shortcut. But the real wrecking ball came for the engineering firm. In a landmark ruling by the Missouri Board, the principal engineers of Jack D. Gillum and Associates were found guilty of gross negligence, misconduct, and unprofessional conduct. They were stripped of their licenses, the professional equivalent of a death sentence. It was a statement that echoed through every drafting room in the world. A signature isn't just ink, it's a covenant with human life. If you look at the pinky finger of a Canadian engineer and increasingly their American counterparts, you might notice a small, unpretentious band of stainless steel. It's called the iron ring. It's not a trinket of success or a piece of Italian Renaissance ornamentation. It is often rough, with sharp facets that are meant to rub against the paper as the engineer draws. It is a tactile reminder of the Hyatt Regency, a reminder of the 114 souls crushed because someone was too cake-decorator to check their math. The ring is a legacy of caution, a way to ensure that the convenience of the fabricator never again takes precedence over the integrity of the structure. It's an authentic way for the industry to hold on to the game, even after the original game was lost in Kansas City. Today, the Hyatt Regency has been rebranded as a Sheraton, but it remains a dignified monument to that close call with history. The atrium is still there, soaring and mammoth in size, but the floating skywalks are gone. In their place is a single, grounded crossing on the second floor, supported by massive, unshakable concrete pillars. It is a design that embraces the earth rather than mocking it. It is a humble admission that sometimes the architectural elitists need to side on historic preservation of life over the gimmicks of weightlessness. In 2015, a memorial was finally dedicated in a nearby park. It doesn't use flamboyant marble or neoclassical Italian accents. It's a simple, elegant sculpture that lists the names of the common people who were just looking for a social ritual on a Friday night. It stands as a reminder that the art of common people lends charm to a city, but the science of the engineer lends them a future. So, at what price do we compromise? Should we trade our skyscrapers for convenient modifications? Or should we demand a world where the silver spoon developers and the cake-decorating architects are held to the same standard as the people walking on their clouds? I'd like to end this long-form series with a poll. If you believe the iron ring should be a mandatory requirement for every architect and engineer globally, share this video. I'd be curious to see what percentage of the viewers share my opinion on the matter. Also, support the channel by subscribing, checking out our series, Tales of Urban Decay, and our daily stories. This is your host, signing off.